Okay, everybody, congratulations on making it this far in the course. This is our last lecture. I'm both excited and sad to be recording this last lecture. I also might be in the midst of making a terrible decision. Normally, I close my office door when I'm recording lectures, but my two cats seem to get very anxious and stressed when they can hear me talking and can't get into the room. So I've left the door open for now, but I have this weird foreboding sense that this is going to go horribly, horribly wrong. So I'm going to ask you in advance for your patience if I have to step aside and kick these animals out. Okay. Also, I'm sad to be not able to give this lecture on sex offenders live. This is probably my favorite lecture to give, mostly because my area of research has focused on sex offenders for the last 15 years. So this is one that's very fun for me. I've been giving variations on this lecture on sex offenders. I update it, I tailor it to specific courses and audiences, but I've given some version of this lecture for maybe 10 years now. And so one of the things that I like about it a lot is there's lots of room for, I think, really good room for interaction with the students. And I'm sorry that I won't be able to share that with you now, but we will do as we can with what we've got. Okay, so the first section, the first part of this lecture is going to be discussing a little bit the scope of the problem of sex offending. So some data, some statistics, and a little bit on some of the story behind the statistics. Uh, can't remember if we've talked about this explicitly in the class, but all official records of crime are underreported in some way because not all offenses do get reported to police, but sex offenses stand out in particular as having some of the lowest rates of being reported to police. And so there's, with the biggest gap between what's really happening and what gets brought to the attention of the criminal justice system, it's important to kind of dig into a little bit some of the story behind the numbers. So for that reason, typically victimization reports tend to be the most reliable way indexing the scope of this problem rather than looking at police reports. So it's surveys that tend to ask people, have you been victims of these types of offenses? Even that being said, that doesn't mean that all victimization surveys are equally reliable or good quality. Sexual assault is a very emotional type of offense, brings up a lot of disgust and a lot of strong emotional reactions from many people, and you can see that in a lot of the research that happens. And so partly related to that, there tends to be huge variability in results across victimization surveys, and it might depend on the results you get for how many people have been sexually offended against will depend on who you ask and particularly how you ask them. Um, so some and so in particular how you ask them, depending on how you define sexual offenses. I've seen surveys that have had ridiculously narrow definitions of sexual assault or sexual offenses, up to those who consider all kinds of maybe uncomfortable or unwelcome behavior as sexual offenses, but they wouldn't actually be criminal behavior. So it really does depend on how you phrase these things, and it's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at victimization surveys. Nonetheless, some of the data we do have suggest that roughly 8 to 24% of women and roughly 0.5% to 7% of men have been victims of sexual assault. There was one study in 2008 that in a survey they found roughly 2% of Canadians had been victims of some form of unwanted touching or assault, sexually related assault in the last year. That's more looking at offenses against adults. Looking at sexual abuse of children, survey data is suggesting in 1994, roughly 20% of girls and 5 to 10% of boys had been sexually abused in childhood. These surveys are typically asking people as adults looking back into their childhood. Whether these events had occurred. So the conclusion, it does vary considerably across studies, but it's, minimally, it is not a negligible minority that is affected by this. This is something we should be concerned about. In terms of in the criminal justice system, there tends to be a lot of concern in media and various sources about sex offenders in the criminal justice system. The reality is they do, similar to homicide last week, sex offenders do make up a very small proportion of cases that are in the criminal justice system. We've seen this graph before of all of the different types of offenses in adult criminal court. And for sex offenses, you see other sex offenses are 1.1%, and sexual assault is about 0.8%. So roughly about 2% of all of the offenses in adult criminal court are for some type of sexual offending. But as alluded to before, one of the big issues is underreporting of sex offenses. It's really hard to know from police data or any official crime data what the crime rates actually are. So there's a lot of surveys that have asked people, have you been a victim of these offenses and did you actually report it to police? And results of these surveys also vary because it depends again on who you ask and how you ask it. And what you tend to see, these are some different surveys that have been conducted. What you see is surveys tend to report the lowest level of reporting of sex offending for victims of incest offending. So that's when the perpetrator has been a family member. That can often be the case because there's so many social repercussions to reporting the abuse. The person might become estranged from their entire family, which might be something that they don't want to see happen. Particularly, unfortunately, there have been a lot of cases where a child has disclosed being abused by their father, for example, and their father is sent to prison, and then their mother starts to treat the child quite poorly, viewing the child as kind of the architect of the difficulties that the family is having, especially if the mother is reliant on the father for financial support and that income is disrupted through the jail sentence. So sadly, there have been too many cases where a victim who has reported the offense has been ostracized by their family. So not surprisingly, we tend to see the lowest rates of reporting of sex offenses among incest offenders. We tend to see the highest rates of reporting for serious sexual attacks. Essentially, the more typically the more violent an offense is, also if it's more likely when they're committed against strangers, those tend to be circumstances where these offenses are much more likely to be brought to the attention of the police. Again, like with many offenses, there's a huge spectrum of the types of offenses that are committed. And most people, when they think about sex offenses, they tend to think of situations of, for example, a rapist attacking somebody outside, kind of in the park or something like that. Those tend to be less frequent. Those are much more likely to be reported to the attention of police. A lot of other sex offenses might be something like someone's had too much to drink at a bar and maybe grabs the buttocks of another person at the bar, and maybe people kind of call them out on it, or the bouncers remove them from the bar. But typically in those types of situations, the police don't get called and charges aren't laid. So again, just a reminder, there's a whole spectrum of behaviors that would be covered under the gamut of sex offenses. So they are underreported. More violent ones do tend to get reported. Unfortunately, for various social reasons, incest offenses less likely to be reported. One piece of information that's quite good news is I haven't actually integrated this into the lecture, but there is new police data coming out since the Me Too movement started around 2017, suggesting that much more sex offenses are being reported to police in recent years. So we potentially have a great trend of reducing that gap between offenses that occur and what gets reported to the police. Another important question to ask, and this is something I usually like to ask students, is whether they think official rates of sex offenses are increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. And I usually get a mix of a lot of different answers. Often, if you look at the media, people tend to think that it's increasing because you see so many examples. The reality is officially reported sex offenses have been declining since the early 1990s, and this is very similar to many of the other crime rate patterns that we've seen in this course. So what you see, this is from the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics in Canada. Rates of police reported sex offenses were increasing quite dramatically in the 1980s, and then they've been steadily declining since the early 1990s, and this pattern has largely continued, except we'll except that in recent years it's increasing again. But that raises an important question of whether some of these big increases are, and decreases as well, are real. Given that so many sex offenses are underreported, are these patterns real? Can we trust them, or are they just a function of higher rates mean more people are reporting and lower rates mean fewer people are reporting? And that's a great question. We do see for a lot of other types of crimes that have consistently high rates of reporting to the police, there were similarly, they increased throughout the 80s. So that suggests that there probably was a real increase in sex offenses in that time period. But the increase in sex offenses was steeper, and part of that might be related to there were key changes in legislation in the 1980s for what counted as a sex offense. For example, rape was very narrowly defined, that it required specific forms of penetration, whereas now sexual assault is more broadly defined as any unwanted sexual touching. Also, prior to 1984, it was not illegal to force sex upon your spouse, whereas now marital rape is considered a criminal offense. So, and all of that reflects increased societal awareness about sex offending. So there probably was not quite a, pre-internet, but not quite a Me Too movement in the 1980s. But there were trends and patterns suggesting more people were reporting sex offenses. And we're seeing, I think, a similar increase now in what's coming to attention of the police because of the Me Too movement. I think we're potentially moving towards a climate that is becoming more supportive of reporting sex offenses, which is a good thing. I've seen at some conferences some police departments bragging about their increases in officially reported sex offenses because they do believe that that means that their community has faith in them, that they're going to take those claims seriously and try and charge the perpetrators. But the dark side to that. If some of the increases are an artifact of societal changes, then looking at some of the decreases in sex offending rates in the official data, does that mean sex offenses are actually declining over time? Or is that also an artifact of maybe just fewer people in those decades were reporting to police? So I believe, and there's a lot of discussion in this in the literature, but I believe that there is enough evidence to suggest that there is a real and true decline in sex offenses in the last few decades. And even with an uptick in reported sex offenses after the Me Too movement, I don't think that means that actual sex offense rates are up. I still think that they are lower than they have been in previous decades. And there's some additional research that we can look at to assess that claim. So this was a really great compilation of data that was presented in 2008, looking at some of the scandals related to sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And what they did is they cataloged thousands of cases of identified sexual abuse in the church in the United States, and they plotted when the abuse actually occurred and when the abuse was finally reported and came to light. And they found huge differences. They found that the sexual abuse actually increased throughout the 1950s. It peaked in the late 1960s and stayed quite high up until around 1980. And then there was a dramatic drop in the abuse from the 1980s until 2002, which was the end of their data collection period. However, when the abuse was reported, was barely ever reported in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when some of this abuse was actually at its highest. Then there was a 5 times increase in the reporting rates in the 1980s, and then an additional 4 times increase in the reporting rates in the 1990s up until 2002. So very much a long delay between when the abuse was happening and when it got reported. And so what that actually means is by the time we became aware of just how widespread this problem was, the worst of it was actually over. Again, that's not to say leave your children alone with priests without caution. Doesn't mean, we need to be complacent or not worry. But what the data is suggesting is that actual sexual abuse of children in the Catholic Church has declined quite considerably from insanely high rates that we saw up until the 1980s. There's also been surveys of adults looking at sexual abuse when they were children, as well as official rates of just child sexual abuse cases that have come to through the system. So David Finkelhor is a key researcher in this area, and so from reviews that he's conducted, he found that from 1990 to 2004, there was the substantiations of sexual abuse against children were roughly cut in half in that time period. So that was very promising. But again, the cynical people could say, well, maybe it's because people stopped taking these cases seriously or they didn't have the resources to investigate them. So again, a much more informative methodology is to do surveys asking people if they've been sexually abused in childhood and plot that against the decades when they would have been children. And so there's at least 2 self-report victimization surveys asking people about abuse in childhood that have shown that sexual abuse of children did show similar decreases in the 1990s from what you see in the official data. So there's victimization surveys indicating that children are less likely to be sexually abused. And those were cases from the United States as well as Ontario. And this relates to a whole bunch of other data we have on various adverse conditions and risk factors and behaviors that tend to be correlated with sexual abuse as well, potentially as a result of sexual abuse. So there also is declines in physical abuse substantiations, sexual assault victimizations among teens, not just children, other violent victimization among teens, juvenile victim homicides, and domestic violence. So a lot of other criminal behavior impacting children and youth have also been on the decline. There's also been marked declines in teen suicide rates, running away, juvenile delinquency, and teen pregnancy. And all of these things tend to be more common among survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So if there's reductions in sexual abuse of children, you would also expect to see reductions in some of these things as well. So all of this to say, I don't think this is an isolated pattern. I think the data is quite clear that most types of offenses have been declining since the early 1990s. Sexual offenses are just one part of that, and there's all sorts of related victimization surveys and other types of data to suggest that this is in fact a real decline, not just perhaps a measure of the ineptitude of police or crime data. So there probably is real declines in sexual abuse of children and of adults, which is wonderful and fantastic news. And that brings us to what's hopefully a question on many of your minds, which is why? Why are sex offense rates declining? Not to look a gift horse in the mouth, but what are some of the possible reasons for the decline? And I do like to take a few minutes with students normally and get some of their guesses and hypotheses about why sex offense rates are declining. There's so many different reasons that have been discussed as possibilities in the literature, and the reality based on what we've talked about and other things in this class is that there's probably no single explanation. There probably is a dozen different factors that have all contributed to this, maybe some more than others, but it's likely a confluence of things that have contributed. So some of the strongly cited reasons for declining rates of sex offending is our population is aging. There is an increase in obesity and other health related issues. All of these things tend to decrease the sex drive and libido. So, in reality, if you were to look at the current demographic of our population, I'm not speaking about anyone in particular, but the North American demographics as a whole, compared to any other period in history, we are pretty old, fat, and sedated. So related to the health, there's increased use of all kinds of medication like antidepressants and other things that can be very beneficial for mental health related issues, but can also decrease the sex drive. So there are a lot of factors related to the demographic features of our population that that could be decreasing the rates of sex offenses. There's also all kinds of cultural and societal changes. The 1960s and 70s were a period of a lot of experimentation in drugs and exploring of many boundaries, and some of this idea of the sexual revolution and exploring much more permissive attitudes towards sexuality, which can be great in a lot of areas, but there's some hypothesis that potentially some people took this too far in terms of exploring large gaps in age ranges, for example, having sex with younger and younger people. Um, and so part of the culture is that there may have been more inappropriate boundaries regarding some sexual behavior at some periods of time that have changed. Also, much greater awareness that has changed in how people supervise and parent their children. Especially in the 1980s, people were becoming a lot more aware of sexual offending against children, particularly committed by strangers, even though most sex offenses are committed by someone the child knows. And suddenly, people didn't let their kids out in the neighborhood unsupervised in the same ways that they used to. I'm part of the one of the last generations of free range kids, where I could go anywhere I wanted in the neighborhood. My parents didn't need to know where I was as long as I was home by dark. But that is becoming increasingly less common. So there's potentially reduced opportunities for students to be out in the community meeting neighbors that might end up molesting them, or strangers that might end up abducting them. So much tighter supervision of children. Also, some idea that many crime rates might be related to stresses in the economy and other various kind of large societal forces. And so economic prosperity in the 1990s might have had the effect of decreasing all sorts of crime rates, including sex offending. And then, of course, we like to think and hope that we, as people who work in the criminal justice system, have played some role in this decline. Over the last few years, we've seen numerous changes in how sex offender treatment and sex offender management and assessment has been conducted, and hopefully those have all been effective in actually reducing the rates of sex offending. We talked about in the lecture on psychopathy, we talked about that really bizarre treatment program in Ontario that used LSD to try and encourage people, many of them were sex offenders, to gain greater insight, and that would try and cure them of violent behavior. And so I'm proud to say we have gotten much better than that at delivering treatment with offenders. So ideally, that has been working. Okay, I have a slide on the consequences for victims. I'm going to hope that it is not a tough sell to convince you that sex offenses are bad and should be avoided. There are victims of sex offenses are more likely to experience a variety of problems compared to people who have not been victimized. But one thing I do want to add is that does not mean that every victim is severely negatively impacted. The response of individuals can vary on all sorts of factors based on factors of the victim themselves prior to the offense, as well as the nature of the offense. And what sorts of supports they might have in their life afterwards. So there's not necessarily a guarantee of serious adverse effects, but so you do see kind of a lot of different types of responses and severities based on a variety of factors. But on average, victims of sex offenses are more likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder, they're more likely to suffer from depression, and they're more likely to experience problems in sexual functioning. And this can kind of go in both directions. These problems in sexual functioning might mean a lack of desire for sex, so kind of a chronic discomfort or inability to really enjoy an active, healthy sex life. Or sometimes you see the opposite of kind of overactive sexual functioning in terms of preoccupation with sex. You can also see among victims of sex offenses more likely to engage in sexual risk taking, compulsive sexual behavior, but simultaneously to have low satisfaction in their sex life. These types of negative consequences tend to increase in frequency when the sexual abuse occurs between the ages of 6 to 18 years old, if the victim was injured during the abuse, if they were sexually abused by more than one perpetrator, and if the perpetrator was a family member. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of the lecture, and I will see you in part 2 shortly.